Yeah. Okay, yeah. I think I'll go with this, yeah. I had to delete some internal storage. Um, so, like, anyway, I just want to talk because I had started on a previous one earlier tonight, and I don't know what time it is. But anyway, yeah. So, like, it got cut off and segmented. Well, it didn't get segmented. It just got like completely cut off because the internal storage was full. But anyway, yeah, that's kind of like thinking about the thing about center point energy and what's going on like right now with this situation. This is year 2025, okay, and it seemed that a lot of information has ultimately led to certain specific issues. That has led to like the Boolean chart as compared to like sequencing characterization in sets of 4, only using 2 numbers like binary numbers are with computer programming and language, normally associated, directly with, architecture platform, embedding and encryption. Yeah, so it seems to be like those are not only the idea that relation is more of a degree level, a ripple center to consensual participation. It seems to be that the architecture and platform present more so of a gross national product of like ergonomic, like gross national product and importing and exporting that way of like commercial venue living quarters. Embedding encryption seems to be the issue whether a degree level of ripple standards to consensual participation is only based upon the idea that linguistic alphanumerics based upon pronunciation as compared to a preference as compared to availability or configuration based upon what is needed and accomplishing that as the way configuration would dictate as a mandatory requirement. Yeah, so availability seems to be whether or not if it's going to be a factor of geographics or, really what availability means, and probably more so of economics than anything really. But in any case, so like I was kind of like thinking about that because it seemed to be that when it has ultimately got to the idea that that Texas New Mexico Power, it seemed to be, the thing about, really Mercedes introducing the smart car, the Smart for 2, and it seemed to be that really that center point energy kind of presents that issue. I mean, it's almost kind of like not knowing anything or how to define maybe what might be maybe misconceived, or a factor of whether knowing or not knowing is really the issue of like center point energy being used as Region 0 or the North American Free Trade Act as non-negotiable, non-transferable. I mean, if you want to call energy trade and energy the idea of willingness of participation based upon a history of a foreknowledge of performance monitoring is more so more along the academic level of a foreknowledge, and how energy trading would only be the idea really of a carbon footprint and absentee voting in a way that would place I don't know if I would call it like a current resident. I mean, trade and energy could potentially be the idea of like even a current resident having fair use but not claiming ownership of the rights as intellectual property, and ultimately it seemed to be whether or not if the who knows anyway form is some idea of governance, or yeah, in the event of an actual emergency, this system has been developed that in the event of an actual emergency, you would have been told. I mean, or is it if the who knows anyway form um, is recognized as bartering and trading information in such a way that would be, maybe I should start over here. It seems to be that whether or not if a current resident is the idea of intellectual property being used, having fair use is like the international phrase of the century of intellectual property, having fair use of an easement, but not claiming ownership. It presents the, well, it's not infringement or a breach of copyright based upon whether or not if it's being used in a way that would maybe be as a standard, as a guide for, promoting having fair use. But anyway, so like it seemed that center point energy had become an issue, reflecting even, symbolic representation. And it seemed to be what I've really kind of like realized that the Stargate program, and when linguistic alphanumerics is involved, that symbolic and analytical, based upon pronunciation and available information, seems to be really the issue. It's kind of like the Boolean chart presents 6 in characterization in sets of 6, and it presents symbolic representation more so on an analytical in a symbolic way, and I haven't really gotten really into it. Really at all. The thing with this is that just based upon linguistic alphanumeric with other information that's already been discussed and what availability really means in a whole different perspective. It's like the McDonald's golden arches with 2 half cycles above what would be normally like 1 cycle per second of frequency being measured per second in oscillation, with the center line of oscillation being side by side. Is the practical application of the principle like McDonald's golden arches, both half cycles above the center line of oscillation. And the thing about a half cycle above and below being side by side, and realizing something about the delta force, bandwidth and spectrum, and it becoming the idea of like a productive symbolic representation that would present, the idea of like, fertility, or a source, potential as a projected estimate. The idea that relation between architecture and platform is not limited to a degree definition of intended use based upon academics, but likewise in addition, at a personal level, separate from the academics, like normally the word relation is really the word, and the embedding encryption and getting that way, it seems to be that half cycle above and below representing McDonald's golden arches, and it gets to the price of gold going up and down, or thing. It seems to be about like being baptized during the gold rush and on the Wells Fargo stagecoach. It's almost like a Calamity Jane in the Pony Express, presenting the idea that the delta force has presented the biggest mouth of the river, with the triangle representing the delta. Yet, as far as like the practical application of being side by side, of half cycle above and below being side by side, it's like known to be as an electronic schematic based as a Christian symbolic representation. And I've mentioned it before. It seemed to be more so on the Christian Science side, more so than maybe just the idea of like religion itself. But it seemed to be that applied to it would be a whole new perspective of what a projected estimate option in the future would be, involving the idea of the biggest mouth of the river and a misappropriation allocation to the Mississippi and what the relation is. It's like the affirmative fallopian tube and the fish swimming upstream, about what really takes place, and symbolically representative of like fertility and growth and prosperity and projected estimate and all that stuff about it. Okay, and that's really what configuration about architecture platform embedding encryption is separate from, but the degree definition of intended use, but the practical application of the thing about linguistic alphanumerics is quite a bit about pronunciation. But anyway, yeah, so like it seemed to be that center point energy had become the idea of symbolic representation between the C and the PTIS on the backside of the US $1 bill, and how the misappropriation allocation of the Mississippi and the ISS and the SSI and the PPI, the PPO and the HMO, and the HMO becoming the UO and the euro dollar, and center point energy in the euro dollar, about that halo left side. And the center point is seemed to be, the deal about like Diners Club, about that circle with one line, from top to bottom, and a 90-degree about it. The vertical, in my perspective, it identifies like quantum and reading Japanese from top to bottom. And the three most simplest methods of computation of simple addition, and a minimum required of it actually equating to like 58. And the one line at a 90-degree being like the EE, which is representative, like on Texas Instruments calculator, normally involving calculus, and anything beyond the program of calculus of that EE would pop up, being beyond, or like even an error. But it presents that side-by-side thing of an EE that pops up like what would be normally like an error on a basic calculator of 0.E. It's almost like the halo side of the symbolic representation between the C and the PTIS, yet with what would be together in unity instead of a point in between, would look like, an EE based upon a 90-degree of that one line that would change the value from 58 to 59. And it seemed to be that one of the oldest national landmarks of Highway 59 represents the linguistic alphanumerics, being alphanumerics of like Pearland, Texas, and attenuation. And Highway 59 seemed to be, like the one landmark that represents that one value in the 90-degree, what looks exactly like the Diners Club symbolic representation, placed right into the left side, the halo left side, that in between the C and the PTIS and the back side. And what would normally be like a normal vertical line would be like number 1, but at a 90-degree, it analytically and symbolic kind of like places McDonald's golden arches with both half cycles above in perspective with the thought of like the fish swimming upstream, what would normally be identified as like salmon swimming upstream in the ladder, and what the ladder is, as a projected estimate, or relation in the way of like, practical application, both half cycles above, become the idea of the electronic schematic fish and fertility and prosperity and projected estimate and option and future and all that stuff. But anyway, so it seemed to me that the Diners Club would be like the center point, and that halo left side using it as a 90-degree. Yet the field scope and range of actually like being on side about that. But center point energy, it becomes like almost like the euro dollar as center point. The thing with this is it seemed that center point had become an issue that seemed to be like trade and energy had become an issue. I'm on supplemental security income, and it presents, any overbilling or continual, issue involving billing had become beyond like not cool that I had center point energy ultimately come remove both center point energy. My father, before he passed away in like May of 2018, placed a building on the same acre of land and didn't want to divide the acre into 2 half acres. But he has a building there. And in order to have like, because they said, and not dividing the land would mean that another mailbox would have to be placed as a business, as a business account, not 2 residentials on the same acre, or it would have to be divided into half acres and have 2 residential smart meters. They said that instead of like doing that and keeping it as 1 acre, to place just a mailbox and have a business account there. So that's what my father did. So there was like a business account and a residential, okay. This is the year 2025, okay. He passed away in May of 2018, but previously all that was like taken, and like I'm at this address right here in Pearland, okay. Well, anyway, so like it's been going on, 2 years. Somewhere close to 2 years, I haven't had really any electricity. I've been like running on like a generator, and I'm wanting to get Texas Mexico Power for like every reason. But it's kind of like I had realized something about the North American Free Trade Act and something about and the thing with it is it just seemed to be like a classified ad of some electronics, and this happened previously before about ads, classified ads in a paper for employment, and actual places that like weren't even on or listed or even existing other than a wide open field. And there have been like several ads at locations that normally wouldn't even be presented as the description at the location. And this one particular ad for like an electronic position wound up being like at Jared Jewelers in Pearland, at Pearland Town Center Mall. And I traced it, and it led with all the information based upon, the information like while I'm on the phone or laptop at the time was like, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, had led the information all the way to Europe. An electronic position. And it wouldn't be the first time, something not really computing as anything normal. It's like that one particular ad, okay? But all the information that seemed to be, that had led to, like the misappropriation allocation of the Mississippi, and the halo left side between a C and a PTIS on the back side of the US $1 bill had ultimately got to like Mercedes-Benz introducing the smart car, Smart Bein 71 like Caroline, and Centerpoint Energy like the smart meter, and it ultimately got to all this information that had led with the difference between bandwidth and spectrum, measuring 1 cycle per second, and oscillation with half above and half below, and practical application of McDonald's golden arches being side by side applied to the half above and below, becoming the side by side issue, like an electronic schematic visual, kind of like of like fertility, predicted estimate option in the future based upon configuration, what it was required, but and ultimately it got to the idea that that one particular ad was like at the address of like Jared Jeweler, and all the information it seemed to be that somehow, since it was like at Jared Jewelers, okay, and it's like known to be like a bunch of gold and diamonds, okay. And all that information in Secrets of the Temple House of Photos runs the country about De Beers diamonds, European, German owned, mining for raw diamonds in South Africa, and it got to all the information that seemed to be leading to like Chevrolet Geo Prism and Hyundai Excel. Okay, yeah, it seemed to be presenting the idea that the Eurodollar and Mercedes introduced in the smart car had led to the Maxwell Smart. So get smart, get Maxwell Smart, and Centerpoint Energy becoming some idea like with all that information combined, like the Eurodollar between the misappropriation allocation of Mississippi and the ISS and the SSI and the PPI and the PPO and the HMO becoming a euro, the Eurodollar thing about all the alphanumeric linguistic and acronyms and abbreviations and all that analytically had really given, based upon the information that was available, okay. In any case, so like it seemed to be that trade and energy had become maybe the potential of Region Zero, reflecting some idea of a carbon footprint, absentee voting, that would be an idea of whether or not if product registration had been maybe a foreknowledge of performance monitoring, placing the idea, because after 2 years of being on YouTube, beginning in 2020 to 2022, progressively, the idea that I'm in a tent in my own home right now. Of course, the idea that potentially, trading information had placed whether or not if a foreknowledge of performance monitoring had only presented maybe the perception of me making my videos on like YouTube, just hurry up and get as much of it of me like on YouTube as possible. And I started getting that perception because it seemed to be that a lot of information had been continue the issue of whether or not that really the idea of whether or not that a vice president network is the idea that whether or not that the carbon footprint and absentee voting had only placed the idea of whether or not if the idea of like trade and energy would only represent maybe the idea of a smart meter that had been used as region zero, and not fully realizing the thing about a transition that you know, I mean, had I not really experienced or remembered certain factors as significant, and it ultimately, you know, led to like Mercedes-Benz in the Circle Line area on Highway 6 and Highway 59, and certain factors about a coupon in the mailbox, and Mercedes, you know, like once again, you know, in front of me, beside me, behind me, in oncoming traffic, and at the time there's coupon LASIK laser corrective eye surgery, and I might as well do it real quick. Yeah. So this one particular person, once again, LASIK laser corrective eye surgery, and yay, it's the thing that the connectivity of that being like on FM 528, okay, and that being in my mailbox each time over a 15-year period had become like only because of a laser, and not realizing that the laser had been involved as a pitching injury, and all the information that kind of like a picture's a picture, and you know, like you can see me on my YouTube.com channel, WadeASVPriddy, PRIDDY at YouTube.com, okay. The thing of it is that ultimately it got to the prefix of the White House, and it was really only because of the second time of a laser, and the only one and only other time was like 1979 at the age of 15 is what the deal is, and realized that the laser had been involved, okay, and it kind of served as a point of origin, and thinking, you know, a picture is a picture, and all the information with Paper Made and 56 Sin and Roe v. Wade, and hopefully getting to maritime law, really, which seems to be the deal with the ship channel, and the idea of like center point energy being the thing of the halo left side, and some idea that, you know, so get maximum smart from center point energy, and the Mercedes introducing the Smart for Two car, and ultimately even, you know, the Scion IQ and the Saturn Sky and the Lexus LFSA seem to be, I mean, the thing about that, as well as like Texas and Mexico Power. And I'd mentioned that, you know, whether or not if center point energy is the idea of just the Eurodollar or region 2, it only seemed to be that Texas and Mexico Power would be the region 1 thing to do, and not really a question of citizenship or birthrights, because I mean, it seemed to be that knowing or not knowing a foreknowledge of performance monitoring of a vice president network as a foreknowledge, or even knowing really is really what the deal is. It seemed to be whether or not if vice president network claiming having fair use of intellectual property is the only idea of information as having fair use, but not claiming, you know, the ownerships of the rights. The thing with it is that it got that personal information that had become, you know, like having American Express Bluebird card. It's a 15-digit number, and it seemed to be like over a baptism at the Mormon Church, which is it's a known fact that the Mormon Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is like the American religion. Okay, the thing with this is that I wouldn't have ever thought that would be an issue of a vice president network claiming having fair use of like the King James Version Bible as maybe immigration custom enforcement as vice president network, and seemed to be the only thing about, you know, suppression and loss prevention is like presenting, you know, the issue of like claiming some ideas as loss prevention as a deed restriction, or having fair use only based upon a deed restriction in television programming, or suppression and oppression, and, you know, seem to, you know, like gaining control of my own birth certificate or birthrights, or potentially, you know, the elite American, and, you know, making it great beyond, you know, internet protocol of a local area network of maritime law, seem to be like an issue, even having, you know, an American Express card, and continual, you know, issues that seem to be like, you know, it's almost like financial institutions is claiming that, you know, citizenship as an American is just like a bunch of financial institutions claiming that they have fair use of the U.S. dollar in the form maybe of a securities exchange, and the only thing negotiable, non-transferable itemization would only be the non-decreed issue of what boundaries and limitations would only mean to like a news anchor as a geographic attachment. Having fair use may be given the impression of, you know, a U.S. dollar in the form of whether or not if a foreknowledge of performance monitoring would only give the impression of whether if product registration is the only issue of citizenship and birthrights, or trading energy that would represent some idea of like, you know, who knows anyway form of like, you know, a carbon footprint and absentee voting in the form of product registration, or no product registration, or, you know, whether or not if some idea of biometrics precedes the idea of you know, a footprint on a birth certificate, or citizenship and birthrights, you know, had progressed, you know, beyond the thought of some idea like suppression and loss prevention. The way the FDIC doesn't really claim, it's not really even identified as, you know, the system has been developed that in the event of an actual emergency you would have been told where to tune into. And it seemed to be the only thing about national security is just like turning the television on. It seemed to be whether or not if product registration is the only idea of whether or not the significance is a foreknowledge, and if that foreknowledge is significant, that reflects maybe whether if the U.S. dollar is only the idea of non-negotiable, non-transferable itemization, only based upon the foreknowledge of whether or not a product registration only suggests the availability of like who has fair use of what, or the who knows anyway form. So like it's got to the point now that somewhere between like Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal Act, okay, it seemed to be that Wyatt Earp, you know, the ERP in Earp presents that exclusionary rule provision like executive power, sovereign immunities, and governmental amnesties. And, you know, it seemed to be that really, you know, it seemed to be really involving like rural routes. The Postal Service, goes all the way back to Calamity Jane and the Pony Express. And, you know, all that prepaid postage. And the thing of it is that it just seemed to be like an ongoing issue. And it seemed like right now, you know, getting my American Express, it seemed that just having my citizenship and birthrights and using an American Express Bluebird card has only got to, you know, whether or not if a bunch of financial institutions is trying to actually claim an American stature based upon, you know, a foreknowledge of, you know, some contesting factors, as some idea, as the FDIC claim of whether or not if a deed restriction is the only loss prevention, and as suppression of like monetary and domestic of neighborhoods, as compared to gross national product, it seemed to be more so on the side of annuity, of obstruction of justice. And right now it seemed to be that the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, it's one Justice Park location. It seemed to be really ultimately, it seemed to be, you know, like my name is Wade, okay? I didn't really think of it as any ideas like, you know, the front lines of the beachfront, and it's not that I have to, but I'm not going to be blind or insignificantly ignoring really the deal about, you know, maritime law. And it seemed that really, you know, the thing about maritime law as making it be on the front lines of the beachfront, and, you know, the American Idol thing about J. Edgar Hoover being amphibious, you know, beyond the thought of like being liquidable equity as like dormant and insignificant, and the only thing about using it is like maybe you know, getting rid of it before, you know, any depletion of any remaining value, you know. Or, you know, the requirement that others might, you know, need and made available, you know, for every, you know, practical purpose. But anyway, yeah, so like it seemed that it had gotten to, you know, like Centerpoint Energy becoming, you know, some idea like the center point being involving the euro dollar. And the idea that whether or not that the euro dollar is the only factor of product registration or not, or foreknowledge of performance monitoring had only been the idea of importing and exporting in the way of whether or not if a commercial venue of living quarters had only presented the idea as a foreknowledge, or product registration had only been the idea of whether or not if foreknowledge of performance monitoring had only been some idea of the North American Free Trade Act, somewhere between the North American Free Trade Act or what is sometimes you know, identified as NAFTA, North American Free Trade Act, or NATO, and I don't know if it's the smartest thing to do to combine the two as appreciation and depreciation. North American Free Trade Act doesn't always identify itself as like some idea of annuity or product registration as like a tax credit, or non-taxable in the way of prepaid tax. North American Free Trade Act doesn't normally identify itself as the principles and practical application of like non-taxable income as a prepaid tax, serving as some idea as a representation of a name and identity as some idea, you know, tax credit being some ideas, some like principle of like non-taxable income, yet a prepaid tax, yet a product registration, and the North American Free Trade Act doesn't really identify some idea of collections that would be representative of a pool having a right to a symbol, or a percentile in the way completely opposite of a percent, but the full field, scope, and range, more so on the annuity side, not necessarily the settlement side of litigation, de facto res habeas corpus that seem to be the idea more so of monetary and domestic of neighborhoods. And all that information is a foreknowledge of performance monitoring. It seemed that really, based upon all the information, the way things are really happening, is that it's led that a transition to Texas New Mexico power would be, you know, removing any question of like citizenship and birthrights. Because right now it seems to be whether or not if a bunch of operators is just presenting the idea. And it seemed to be like even Pennzoil, somewhere between like New York and like Houston, has presented some idea. And it seemed to be, you know, Pennzoil as well as like even, you know, like Capital One, and certain factors between like the International Electronic Engineering and OPEC being the 39 thing about it, has been the idea that somewhere between John Wayne and Wyatt Earp, the Roosevelt New Deal Act, it presents the energy side of those two, the International Electronic Engineering Organization and OPEC. And it seemed to be whether or not if an intellectual duration only represents the real owners of the rights of what's involved with it, seemed to be like really what's going on now, and it seemed to be that Texas and New Mexico power is like a requirement of the Roosevelt New Deal Act between Theodore and Franklin, or even, you know, the Univision thing that seemed to be seemed to be more so along the lines of pie charts of business law, as compared to what would be maybe, you know, the idea of like Connect 4 between Univision that was at the time, you know, on West Loop 610 on the outer loop side at the intersect, you know, like Highway 59 and West Loop 610 and the Houston Post, and it being diagonal. It's almost like the game Connect 4, because Univision actually has the 3 pastels in the black and the 3 pastels in the white, and was the real thing about, you know, the colors and symbolic representation about Univision. Somewhere between like Minute Maid Field and the Houston Musicians Union really presents the plain horizon of importing and exporting, more so than the pie chart. In international, like importing and exporting, the plain horizon is more so of like, you know, beyond, you know, the pie chart of like business law, and more so of the plain horizon of corporate, multinational corporations of importing and exporting. The plain horizon, Minute Maid Field right there, and Houston Musicians Union presents, I mean, like We International, and I mean, even the thing about the plane horizon, and normally identified in economics as, you know, the major source of, like, you know, international, like, import and exporting. And Minute Maid Field in the Houston Musicians Union, I mean, really kind of presents quite a bit about that analytically, knowing really the history of television in this area and certain factors of, I mean, just scale. And it seemed to be symbolic and analytically that way of, like, a Stargate program of importing and exporting, and, you know, even boycott and embargo, and what clearance only means of loss prevention as compared to suppression of, like, aggregates. And it seemed to be whether or not the boycott and embargo is the only issue, whether if clearance is really only the idea of beyond a neighborhood or monetary domestic of commercial venue of living quarter. Similarly of, like, tariff and U.S. patent, and the thing about, you know, 200 miles of protected waters around the United States as compared to the idea of a moat around the Kingsmanship, which seem to be, you know, automatically, you know, the option of 2 9-hole golf courses. And, you know, the thing about the word moat, mute, and moot, there's, like, mute, like silence, M-U-T-E, and there's, like, moot, M-O-O-T, and it's like career students, degreed career students practicing law on campus, and it seemed to be like auditing legal media is involved with, like, you know, like live auditing, like normally we seem to be based on, you know, the way I've heard it and seen it on television, it's like, you know, soap operas. Yeah, so like it seemed to be that really, you know, that you know, that M-O-O-T, it seemed to be the idea that a degree, like, career students practicing, like, law in that way of, like, television programming as compared to what's involved with, like, you know, deed restrictions as compared to television programming, or what the real, you know, issue with national security really seems to be sometimes. But anyway, it's already gone on like 37 minutes, and and I gotta get a little bit of water here. So, like, it's kind of like the idea that Texas New Mexico power, it's kind of like, you know, I'm finding it harder and harder to believe anything about, you know, networking. You know, but in any case, it seems to be that Texas New Mexico power needs to be, I mean, like, the entire, like, headquarters, the entire, like, state of Texas, and even more so, you know, the Houston and surrounding area, you know, like Texas City, Texas, involving Texas New Mexico power. I'm actually, you know, going to get Texas New Mexico power come out here, but I'm actually wanting to make sure that it's going to be, you know, not a question of, like, you know, Texas City, Texas being Texas City, Texas, and make sure that Texas New Mexico power is going to be, you know, Texas City, Texas, not necessarily foreign knowledge is, you know, interrupt, bypass, and some idea of, like, network administrators, Wi-Fi managers, and webmasters presenting some idea of as a VPN as an optional acronym. So, like, you know, in any case, so, like, actually, I'm gonna actually do that, and I've been running on a generator for, you know, more than a year and a half now, really, and yeah, so it seemed to be that whether or not if a product registration is the only idea of whether or not if, like, even American Express card, a 15-digit prepaid card, it seemed to be like a foreknowledge of, like, you know, a bunch of operators presenting some ideas, kind of like, you know, it's like I can't get a word out of anyone other than, you know, seemingly that it's kind of like you just really want someone to sound like they perceive that you're presenting the issue and won't even, you know, communicate about, you know, how you are, you know, made available, you know, as an idea of whether or not if a preliminary purchase of product registration of a birth certificate is the only idea of a vice president network being some idea of having fair use of intellectual property as a carbon footprint, or absentee voting as a foreknowledge of performance monitoring, as the North American Free Trade Act. I mean, ultimately, it seemed to be whether or not if a foreknowledge is only the idea of whether or not if a carbon footprint or product registration is the only idea, whether or not if a current resident would only be the idea or a factor of whether or not if, you know, really what the real issue is of of whether if non-negotiable, non-transferable itemization is the only idea of a degreed or non-degreed issue. Or some idea like the majority. The majority, what majority? The who knows anyway, what performance monitoring majority? Or, the who knows anyway form of, whether or not if a preliminary prejudice or product registration to a birth certificate is the only idea of, whether or not to have significance of product registration is the only idea, identifying, some idea like a source. What would be not necessarily a question as a method of banking, but all of a sudden, does it really put a source of a method of banking into total, complete, an entire lifetime into question? Over foreknowledge of performance monitoring, or whether product registration is the only idea of non-negotiable, non-transferable itemization, or as some idea, as an option of what a current resident is or is not, or claiming having fair use but not identifying an FDIC claim as a deed restriction, or loss prevention in the way of the thought of whether or not the leaving the bank is the only idea. It's like right now it seems to be that an American Express Bluebird card is presenting the idea of being some ideas like some mega multi-billion dollar American and leaving the idea that loss prevention and suppression is more so seem to be only continually loss prevention and an FDIC claim is only the idea of whether or not if foreknowledge or performance monitoring is the only idea that an FDIC claim is the only thought of whether or not if only having fair use is whether or not if managing factors as representative of even supplemental security income, or whether or not if the idea a source of information is the only idea of whether or not if claiming managing factors it's not presenting itself as having a right to assemble, or whether or not if a foreknowledge presenting itself as having a right to assemble and still being surrounded by who knows anyway for him as who's in control of what, practical application of principle, or having appearance thereof but denying the power, having performed the commons but denying the power thereof. I mean for real. So it seemed to be like whether or not if a plane horizon and a pie chart is the only difference of isometric volume. Similar thing about the barrel in the elevator, yeah. But anyway, yeah. So anyway, I just want to get that about the Texas and Mexico Power, because it seemed to be that product registration and a foreknowledge of performance monitoring is the only idea of the acronym of the FBI becoming, the one Justice Park, one being 34 alphanumerically. And it seemed to be the thing about, a conversion between maritime law to aviation and space administration, like NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and making a great beyond internet protocol of a local area network of internet protocol of maritime law is the only idea that being amphibious and J. Goo about, thing, is the only idea of whether or not if citizenship birthrights is the only idea. I mean, it seemed to be whether or not if managing, some idea of a birth certificate or a foreknowledge is the only idea of a deed restriction as an FDIC claim. Because it's not the idea of international financial management of saying software that not only presents the idea that liquid equity is just turning the K television on, or the only idea about a national security issue is not realizing anything about Fox 29 News in Philadelphia of the W television. And it seemed to be that at that point that the Boolean chart, the principles of digital audio is presenting, the factors just seem to be going through a circuit and becoming some idea of being itemized in human capital beyond any possibility of any thought of a canine unit or a kernel becoming a kennel on proper English numerical composition. And what that is in platform and architecture embedding encryption as compared to an Abraham Lincoln Night Vision Shadow Government Stargate program seem to be the real big deal in my mind, at least about a telekinetic world within. and ultimately, the Chevrolet Corvette and even a veterinarian, and think about somewhere in between like Coney Island and their Wiener Schnitzel, there's like a telekinetic roll of the pen. It's like some mind power, and it seemed to be the only issue between a K9 unit and some telekinetic roll of the pen that's just like mind power. When in fact it's not necessarily the grade, but it seemed to be like a must-have, need-to-know thing about the kernel and what's involved with like programming, as like Dr. Pepper would present the DR as a deed restriction, and the 23 ingredients. It seemed to be that the Dr. Pepper presenting the 23 years, the only one that I know of, is the 23-year anniversary celebration, and the 23 ingredients, and the W being the 23rd letter. And certain factors involving the deed restriction, it seemed to be ultimately that Dr. Pepper is presenting the Abraham Lincoln Night Vision Shadow Government Stargate program, and it seemed to be the Bein venue and applied to the Boolean chart. The Boolean chart with and the W and the G, Vantage Love 30, okay, the W and the G, and it seemed to be the one and only thing about the G and the Bein venue, and the idea of making a great beyond the internet protocol of a local area network of maritime law seemed to be the thing about human capital, more so on the expenditure side, going through the circuit, going beyond, the Bluebird bus, and, something about, being placed on, the Airbus H-160, and somehow the Bein venue in Geneva, Switzerland about human civil rights has been a major factor of, like, I'm not real sure, like, why the intensity of incoherence or being fumigated in gas while asleep, and like a whole bunch of seriously not cool things like going on, or even the ability to like really even remember quite a bit about it for a 6 to 9 month period, seemingly potentially an entire like 1 year, and how a head of schedule had become the factor of like world news, national news, local news, and television program in itself, and like realize something about a head of schedule had presented the issue of duration as not realizing that an entire life of a vice president network as a projected estimate and a head of schedule would present maybe the time of not being to account for like every single like second of the day and night because of like what was going on for a 6 to 9 month period, if not an entire year. And the factor about a head of schedule would become the potential of the entire television network, anything with a timestamp, newspapers, books, news, had become, a phenomenally huge issue about, the real suppression, loss prevention of, it seemed to be as a method of banking as compared to annuity, taxation, and electronic, as compared to, some idea of like having fair use as, not necessarily a forfeiture based upon, a registered charity, some idea that some idea of like an endorsing an entire lifetime of, employment, or, the idea that not distinguishing or really realizing something between like business to corporate law, or even business to family law, or some idea like even a 1099 as a sole proprietor, or some vulnerability that might not realize what a right to assemble only means as foreknowledge as compared to a tax ID, between a tax ID as compared to a 1099, and not even realize, how all that could take place and like not even know it. So, that's where it seemed to be where the acronyms come in between a DBA being a database administration doing business as compared to the VPN of a vice president network or a virtual personal network or a foreknowledge of performance monitoring in the way what non-negotiable non-transferable administration only really suggests that knowing some idea, something about the recent statute and the IRA seemed to be, the whole idea of practical application and principle of like a prepaid tax representing some idea of the similarities of like non-taxable income, like supplemental security, and based upon a percent on a continental level, and as compared to like some idea, what would be normally some idea of defaulted student loans in a pool as a percent, as collections being, you know, the idea of like tax-free collections. If I'm not mistaken, that there's a guarantor, a guarantee, and a guarantor, and the student loan it's almost like it's completely taken care of. I mean, like, anyway, it's like set aside as having a right to assemble as a pool is how it's referred to, and that would maybe only suggest liquidable equity in maritime law. Yet the practical application of percent representative of any collections would be, you know, the idea, separate from, you know, the actual, you know, combine of the actual participation, and it becomes almost like a attached, detached fixture in real estate. An attached or detached, it's like a fixture in real estate right there, between a pool of collections as compared to having a right to assemble, and the difference between a percent and, you know, the field, scope, and range, you know, to the fullest extent, in that way. I mean, all the information is there, but a whole different perspective. What projected estimate is as compared to, you know, practical application of principle in a whole different perspective. You know, having a right to assemble, it would be more so like of a multinational corporation, or, you know, even how, like, business and corporate law, and some idea like whether or not the only way economics uses the availability to define the meaning, configuration of incorporation based upon television programming, only because of availability, it seems to be the thing, you know, really about it. But anyway, yeah, so like I'm really kind of like getting off into nowhere about a bunch of directions. That's anyway, so like it seems to be like where it's at right now. It's at the Texas New Mexico Power is like really where it's at right now. It seems the issue whether or not a product registration is or is not the issue of, like, you know, just having an American Express Bluebird card. Because, I mean, is it really ultimately getting to whether or not the, you know, claiming, FDIC claim as a deed restriction, or as the idea of whether or not if settlement is more so on litigation de facto on res habeas corpus is FDIC claim as a suppression, or the thought of like leaving the bank and going beyond, you know, method banking as human capital. I mean, I'm being presented issues that only, you know, a foreknowledge of, like, you know, anyone involved with human capital is presenting the issue and won't even like even say one thing about any of it on the phone. And getting upset about it seems to be the only idea that accomplishing, you know, getting upset. It's not really, you know, like I have better things to do than sound like something that maybe someone would only suggest as some idea of manufacturing a deed restriction based upon, you know, some idea or perception or a conflict of interest. It doesn't sound like it's even taking place during the conversation by a bunch of silence. As really, you know, the idea of, like, you know, communications involving, you know, about, you know, some like linguistic idea of, like, you know, a bunch of silence about a bunch of nothing, and won't even really get involved with, you know, a bunch of, you know, interference, and it seems to be like really whether or not the financial institutions is trying to present the idea of whether or not if leaving the bank is the only idea of what product registration might only suggest is, you know, whether or not if importing and exporting is the only issue of vice president network or immigration's custom enforcement, defining the meaning between some idea of a deed restriction only based upon, you know, suppression as like loss prevention. And it seemed to be all about keeping a person in the bank, involving, you know, K television and a bunch of, you know, stuff that really a commercial venue of living quarter. I mean, it's not a question in my mind that is not affected by a deed restriction or television programming. Some idea as like, you know, a patent protected as compared to some idea like whether or not if the only thing about, you know, product registration would maybe only be the idea of a chronological, you know, a foreknowledge as a previous known, or maybe a disregard as insignificant and maybe potentially a questionable as up for grabs, like a carbon footprint absentee voting of a vice president network. You know, like who's doing who a favor in political science is really what it ultimately gets to. you know, and ultimately, whether or not if you know, absentee voting only represents the idea of, you know, relation. I mean, you kidding me? So it's already going on like 55 minutes, and you know, like right now, it's kind of like, you know, I'm kind of like really kind of wanting to just get, you know, Texas Mexico Power and get the smart meter in, but I'm gonna probably, you know, do a little bit of adjustment about, you know, relocating an electrical box, you know, and you know, having it like redone and like accessible, you know, only like from the inside. Yeah, so like anyway, so like I'm actually trying to, you know, get to the point to like where I don't have to continually explain some idea of like loss prevention and suppression, and experiencing a bunch of technical crap that no one will even admit. You know what participating factors only means is like some idea of loss prevention is like oh my God, there's like someone that really like has like really some good idea of like leaving the bank in the form of human capital, and it's not like a question of whether or not if Geneva, Switzerland, and the Bein venue. It's the only thought of like human civil rights, you know, beyond the idea that a deed restriction in television as a foreknowledge would only be the idea of like auditing legal media as compared to some idea of post-production and editing. And, you know, get some real degree, you know, participation factors, like not a question there. A bunch of scientists like, well, you know, hey, figure it out, you know. And, you know, it seemed to be like get a commercial venue of living quarters and getting above like any and every neighborhood and not having to put, you know, a whole bunch of effort in, like having a normal, like normally comfortable like day without having a contesting issue, just like walking through my driveway, feeling like, you know, the idea of like immigration customs enforcement or importing and exporting some idea of like, you know, some Securities Exchange Commission has like presented some idea of whether or not if intellectual property is the only idea of you know, VSAT communications. You know, and as a foreknowledge, you know, it seemed to be like whether or not if really the 12 Reserve Banks is going to be, you know, some idea of like whether or not if the U.S. dollar is not a question of a news anchor. You know, I never thought of a news anchor as some idea of like television programming that would present, you know, like auditing legal media would be like not a question of you know, not a question of like, you know, post-production or the ability of editing. The thing of it is that, you know, it seemed to be getting above it all and not being restricted or geographically attached. It seemed to be, you know, like, you know, attached to the toilet like a news anchor. Or the question of whether or not if citizenship and birthrights is the only idea of like, don't be fooled by imitations, but practice makes perfect. And I'm sure that like that's really not funny at the same time. Thinking that maybe the idea, like even a musician like that I am, using, you know, what I consider the standard as a drummer, you know, practice makes perfect thing. As a musician, as a drummer, as compared to, you know, the mere meaning, the content and value, you know, what I have to say about, you know, just getting up and going on, and, you know, so like right now it's kind of like, you know, hey, make America great again. Well, go, yeah. So like I'm gonna move to like a Hill HX50. Horizontally propelled aircraft, helicopter, and like a land pad, and all the flight simulators, and a commercial venue of living quarters, all about, you know, audio production and concert, you know, production, distribution, and sales promotions and all that good stuff about, you know, music video and all that stuff about it. And the thing of it is that really, it's kind of like I'm missing like Airmark Arena being like a maximum seating capacity of 26,000 with an indoor like arena, Airmark Arena. Yeah, and something about, you know, the thing about Transept Horizon, it being like a record company, manufacturing, distribution, and everything about it, and including Transept Horizon, yacht manufacturing, manufacturing and distribution, like in Freeport, Texas. Kind of like, you know, hey, you know, like I ate my alphabet soup and decided I was going to be like the executive alphanumeric, you know, executive order. Yeah, so like, you know, kind of like I'm having an alphabet, you know, chronological timeline here. So like in any case, so like you know, it's kind of like the thing about the getting, you know, like a commercial venue and getting above the idea of like any potential of like a boycott and embargo as a method of banking, as a deed restriction based upon, you know, only idea as a foreknowledge of performance monitoring. or FDIC claim is a deed restriction and loss prevention. The only thing about, maybe preventing a person from actually leaving the bank and just like, doing it, and it's kind of, being on supplemental security income and getting above it all has, been not limited to a learn as I go thing, but a whole different perception of, experiencing a circuit and certain factors that seem to be, really the idea of like multinational corporations and banking systems like SAN software, securities and annuities and storage area network, as compared to the thought of like multinational corporations of like gross national product in the form of like who knows anyway of like monetary and domestic. It seemed to be really whether or not a gross national product. I mean, it's like I made the statements kind of like I don't know if I could really even distinguish the difference between State of the Union address and we international. And it seemed to be some of the factors that taking place. It seemed to be the only idea of a world class that's presented. The idea that leaving the bank, of the categorization of money for the mere sake and intent purpose of like an endorsement being the current event, the current affair, and not an issue of like the history of the U.S. dollar, or or knowing that like a grandfathered corporate law is a retroactive presidential administration. It's the only issue of foreknowledge of performance monitoring is really ultimately what it really gets to, and a lot of things that I had heard is it's not what you know, it's who you know, and maybe so, but it's always going to be what a person knows and at what level, at that point in direction and everything that is involved, because it'll always be what everyone knows and who everyone knows, or knowing or not knowing, and as a foreknowledge and realizing something about the entire learn as I go thing. It's become more progressively, the idea of like overcoming some idea of like whether or not if a human capital is ultimately the idea of like loss prevention is the idea of like maybe a deed restriction that it's not ever discussed on television. So like it seemed to be like really whether or not that the only thought of a way of life is only the idea of whether who knows anyway for him, and really what form a deed restriction as loss prevention as litigation, the fact on res habeas corpus define the meaning of lifespan of the easement of intellectual property, and like the accusation of like a foreknowledge of performance monitoring is not identified as loss prevention or suppression as a method of banking, only involving what seems to be only neighborhoods of monetary and domestic as compared to gross national product that presents the plane horizon of isometric value, even a umbrella in an elevator, high-rise towers of powers, and the idea that commercial venues of living quarters, it presents the idea that some idea of freedom is not affected by any television programming as a deed restriction in any kind of way, and it's like really not the question. So like that's really kind of the direction that really I'm really going towards, to get it going on. Yeah, so like anyway, so like I'm working on getting my drum set and getting it going on, and not have these issues of like continually affecting like my health, because it's like seriously like getting like beyond like real not cool. Yeah, so like I mean, if all that's controlled, well then it is. I mean, but like what's the so like in any case, so like I don't know what the deal is about some idea of like having fair use, claiming ownership, but not claiming having fair use, but not claiming the rights of ownership. It's amazing. Seem to be the thing about it, yeah. So like practice makes perfect, but don't be fooled by imitations. So it seemed to be the thing like involving whether or not if having the right to assemble. It's like, I mean, is it really a question of me meeting myself? Like, oh really, huh? Oh yeah. It's the old have I met myself thing, huh? Wow. Tarnishing, oh my god. Having fair use, I mean, the laboring learning you go, it's like, oh, you gotta be kidding me. Yeah. Yeah, you're looking a little experienced there. You're kind of looking fashionably like intellectual, like having fair use of, like, maybe perspiring beyond, the protected boundaries and limitations of a controlled environment. Starting to perspire. Starting to perspire, yeah. Yeah, so like, wow, you're looking really intellectual. Yeah, yeah. So like, any case, so like, it seemed to be like, wow, yeah. So like, all that freedom of idea of like loss prevention is the only idea of struggling whether or not of leaving the base. The only idea of whether or not if getting the commercial venue of living quarters is going to be the idea of like it's almost like, well then, hey, it's kind of like, what is that, like Moses, like, descending from the mount, the plateau, and the Lord Jesus Christ after the resurrection going to the plateau and ascending what would be represented at the second coming of the rapture, the second coming of Christ in mid-air in the sky. It's still like the principle of like Moses getting the 10 commandments coming down, the 10 commandments in the form of Texas, Mexico power. The second coming of Christ is kind of like Moses has 2 tablets in the form of Texas, New Mexico power. The second coming of Christ is kind of like Texas, New Mexico power. Yeah, it's like Moses coming down from the plateau. It's almost like the second coming of Christ in the form of like Moses bringing like Texas, New Mexico power, and Mercedes presenting the Smart for 2 and Maxwell Smart, so get Maxwell Smart, and the Roosevelt New Deal Act in between like Wyatt Earp and John Wayne, and litigation fact over habeas corpus, and the Theodore Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal Act presenting the International Electronic Engineering and OPEC about the energy. It seemed to be really the energy thing about it, and the availability of being made available, and knowing anything about that energy involving international electronic engineering and OPEC. It seemed to be directly the idea of like Texas, New Mexico power that way. And because I was actually following that for a while with the Roosevelt New Deal Act, and it caught something, and I wasn't even expecting it to be an intellectual duration of having fair use and like a mandatory, like, but not claiming ownership of the rights. And that's kind of like, now I see it, now I don't. It's kind of like, well, where's it at again? And I had to remember something about that and wasn't actually anticipating some idea. Now I see it, now I don't. But it seemed to be the idea of like intellectual duration of like the real information. Yeah, so like anyway, it's already going on like 1 hour and 7 minutes and like 50 seconds right now. I'm gonna go ahead and take a break, okay? Anyway, there it is, yeah.